Ezekiel chapter 40 will begin here in verse 1. It says, "In the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year, after that the city was smitten. In the selfsame day the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither." So very quickly, it says the 25th year of our captivity. If you go back to just a few chapters to when they got the message that the temple, the city, had been destroyed, you would calculate about 13 years. Now, because of where it's at in the year, it ends up being the 14th year, as we see in the 14th year after that the city was smitten. And so, if we take this to be the month Nisan, which is the first month of the Jewish calendar, because it says in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, you get about the 10th of Nisan, which is just a few days before the Passover. And so at the time that the Lord is coming to Ezekiel and giving him this message and showing him these things, this is leading up to the Passover. So he's receiving this message to give to the people at a time that they may be willing, that they may be receptive to information, that they may be having the Lord and his things on their mind. We don't know the degree to which the Passover was practiced during the captivity. We don't know how much preparing they were able to do. We don't know to what extent the people as a whole practiced it. But I have to say that I don't think they forgot about it altogether. It would have been something that was still ingrained into the people of Israel. So, moving on into verse 2, it says, "In the visions of God brought he me into the land of Israel, and set me upon a very high mountain, by which was as the frame of a city on the south. And he brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand, and a measuring reed, and he stood in the gate." And so this is a little bit familiar. Most of us have encountered this before. Now, as far as whether this man is an angel, whether this man is Jesus in his pre-incarnate form, we'll be discussing that as we go through these chapters, because this man appears again and again and again throughout the next few chapters. And we'll be dealing with this temple, with this structure over the next few chapters. So he's got a measuring reed, and he's got a line of flax in his hand. He says in verse 4, "Son of man, behold with thine eyes, and hear with thine ears, and set thine heart upon all that I shall show thee, for to the intent that I might show them unto thee art thou brought hither. Declare all that thou seest to the house of Israel." So he sees all these things, and he's supposed to declare. Verse 5, "And behold, a wall on the outside of the house round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long by the cubit and an handbreadth. So he measured the breadth of the building 1 reed, and the height 1 reed." So before we go too much further, let's discuss this measuring reed. It says it's 6 cubits long. Well, how long is a cubit? About 18 inches is what most people would give as the length of a cubit. Some would give 21 inches. Because the cubit isn't necessarily a fixed, firm, standard measurement in Bible times. It's based on biology, and so especially back in Noah's day, you get one person that's a lot taller than another, their cubit's going to be longer because it's here to here. And so this says the reed is 6 cubits long by the cubit and an handbreadth. And so I've seen measurements that I've seen people say it's 18, I've seen people say it's 21. One that I saw was really interesting. They said it's actually more along the lines of about 26 and a half inches, which would be about if you go by palm measurements for when you measure by hands, the height of a horse, you get about 26 and a half inches. And the reason that they argue that for that for that cubit, which is about 7 hands, is that if you take the measurement of that cubit and apply it to all of the measurements that you see throughout the next few chapters, it makes everything make a lot more sense as far as the size of the rooms. So you see chambers that are pretty small if you use the 18-inch measurement or you use the 21-inch measurement, and you see the showbread is upon, and we'll get to this as we go through it, but just looking ahead, if you put the showbread on its table, if you use the 7-hand measurement, about 26 or so inches, it's about the size of a standard countertop or buffet. If you use the smaller measurement, it's lower, and so it doesn't make as much sense. And so that's primarily the reason they argue for that. So regardless, it doesn't change any of the proportions, because everything is proportional. So the basic model of the temple would be the same regardless of whether you use the 18-inch, the 21-inch, or the 26.25 or 26.5 inch. But in my mind, based on that argument and based on what I've seen, I think that using the 26-inch measurement is more realistic to use the 7 hands approach. So anyway, we will move forward just a little bit. It says in verse 6, "Then he came to unto the gate which looketh toward the east, and went up the stairs thereof, and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad, and the other threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad." So here we're looking at it. If you can see here, that would be the east to the west, because you see we're looking at it almost from the position from the northeast a little bit. And so this picture here, this illustration that we have, it's very crude, and I'm using a crude one because I don't want to try to get one that's too fancy, because I don't want to imprint an image onto your mind and make you think this is what it looks like. Leroy said so. Because we don't know exactly what it'll look like. But as far as what we're given in Scripture, this is pretty accurate, fairly, as far as the actual measurements themselves and what the basic outline of the structure would look like. And so when he says the gate, he's talking about this gate here, I believe, on this eastern wall, because this is the eastern wall, this would be the northern wall, this would be the western wall, and then over here this would be the southern wall. And this is in Jerusalem. I'm not going to go too much into detail on the different arguments of why I think the temple is where it is, because for one, it's in Zion. I don't believe that means specifically Mount Zion, which is a smaller mountain that's next to the Temple Mount. I believe that Zion refers to Jerusalem as a whole, and so it sits in the same place. Now, regardless of whether somebody wanted to make the argument that this temple is going to be built on Mount Zion, or it's going to be built in Jerusalem, in Zion, on the Temple Mount, regardless of whatever you want to say, there's got to be geographical changes. There has to be some kind of change to the landscape in order for that to be possible. Because you see, this is a flat structure. It doesn't drop down on the southern side. If you were to build it on the Temple Mount today, there would be an incline just outside of the temple. In order to get to that southern wall, you would have to walk down some stairs because it drops. And then there's another flat area. So here we see that it's all flat, and that's how it's described in Scripture. So there will be changes to the geography. Now we know that's going to be the case from Zechariah chapter 14. We know there will be changes at least around the city of Jerusalem because it's going to be made into plains. You can look at Zechariah chapter 14 verse 10 for that information. So the mountains are going to change. The structure of the land is going to change. regardless. So it could potentially fit on Mount Zion if you wanted to say that that mountain was going to be flattened and then it also expanded. But my personal belief is that it will be on the actual Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, the same place where the previous temple was, the same place where the temple before that was, and it will be there for that 1,000-year period, and it will look pretty much like that. So we'll try to move on and make some progress here. It says, in verse 6, it says, "They went up the stairs thereof and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad, and the other threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad." And so they're walking up through the gate, and in verse 7 it says, "And every little chamber was 1 reed long and 1 reed broad, and between the little chambers were 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate was 1 reed." And so what are these little chambers? Well, it'll go into a little bit of detail on that as we get further into the chapter, but he's just describing what he's seeing. And so here, this picture, what you're seeing, this is the temple complex here that we were looking at before, and I'll bring up the other one. So it's this space here, this central complex location that's inside these 4 walls. And so you can see on the outer walls, there's a chamber here, there's a gate chamber. Here in the inner walls, there are gate chambers. So you have northern gate, eastern gate, southern gate, and then to get into the temple courtyard, you have another northern gate, eastern gate, and southern gate. And all of these gates, and I'll zoom in a little bit if I can, you can see that these gates each are lined with chambers, 3 on each side. Here, 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 another one here, 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 here. They're all identical. So that's what he means when he's talking about these chambers. So we move on. It says in verse 8, he measured also the porch of the gate within, 1 reed. And so that's what this is here, the 1 reed right here. And then there's supposed to be 100 cubits between. So about, a little over 2 feet, which is reasonable for a standard doorway. You wouldn't expect about an 18-inch doorway. That'd be a little bit, 1 reed is 6 cubits, so it would be actually a very large doorway, and it would be enough room to carry in very large items, which I can imagine they would be doing. And we'll read later on, they will also be carrying in animals as part of this as well, such as cows, and cows are pretty large, and so you want to have enough room to be able to fit those things in. It says now in verse 9, "Then he measured the porch of the gate 8 cubits, and the post thereof 2 cubits, and the porch of the gate was inward. And the little chambers of the gate eastward were 3 on this side, 3 on that side, and they were of 1 measure, and the posts had 1 measure on this side and on that side." So here we see the little chambers again are brought up, and the 3 and the 3 on each side. "And he measured the breadth of the entry of the gate 10 cubits, and the length of the gate 13 cubits. And so you have 10 by 13, and so you see these gates are not perfect squares, they're rectangular. One side is a bit longer than the other. So this is, I don't know how perfect, I didn't take a ruler out to the picture and try to measure and get a scale, but in looking at this, it looks like it's about to scale. So it is a rectangular structure here, this gate is, and that's primarily what we're looking at here. The space also before the little chambers was 1 cubit on this side, and the space was 1 cubit on that side, and the little chambers were 6 cubits on this side and 6 cubits on that side. He measured then the gate from the roof of one little chamber to the roof of another. The breadth was 25 cubits, door against door. And again, I told you, I'm no carpenter, I'm no specialist, I'm not a construction person. It makes smoke come out of my ears just to try to read this and even look at this picture and apply it. So I'm going to read it. If you can understand what I'm reading and look at this picture and see what it's talking about, that's good. I don't fully comprehend everything, so I'm just going to go through the best that I can. He made also posts of, this is verse 14, of 60 cubits, even unto the post of the court round about the gate. So that's posts of 60 cubits round about the gate. It says, and from the face of the gate of the entrance unto the face of the porch of the inner gate were 50 cubits. And there were narrow windows to the little chambers, and their posts, and to their posts within the gate round about, and likewise to the arches, and windows were round about inward, and upon each post were palm trees. And so you don't get to see that here in this picture. And this other crude picture, you don't see the palm trees, you just see the structure. So this place isn't going to be just a bland building like we see in this picture. It's going to have greenery, it's going to be lush, it's going to be vibrant, it's going to be teeming with life. Not only with the life of plants, but with people as well. People will be moving in and out, going in and around, and it will be a vibrant place to be at. But we don't get to see all that detail here. So, moving on, it says in verse 17, then brought he me into the outward court, and lo, there were chambers and a pavement made for the court round about. 30 chambers were upon the pavement. And that's where you see here, there's this pavement right here. It goes around the edge. And then there's the chambers that set on the pavement. So you've got lower pavement, and then you've got these chambers here. There's 30 of them. Now, these chambers are within the outer wall. And I don't know for sure what these chambers are. And you don't really get detail in Scripture as to what everything is in all of these different rooms. Some of these could serve as stairwells. Some of them in the Millennial Temple might even be elevators. Some of them may contain utilities type facilities. Some of them may contain bathroom types facilities. I don't know what they will have, but there's going to be all kinds of rooms lining this wall, and they're going to be used for something. Okay? Remember we said last week that the people, when we talked about the people who have the job of doing the burials of the bones after Jesus comes back, and there's just this great, final battle with this great bloodshed that occurs. And there's just all these dirty jobs that need to be done by people. There's still people in the millennial kingdom with human bodies. They still eat, digest, and expel. I assume that in the temple, there's going to be a place to do that and do it as cleanly as possible. People aren't just going to be defecating out in the middle of the temple grounds. I just don't see that happening. So, and I don't think they're going to be, that everybody's necessarily going to be expected to run all the way home to do their business and then come back to the temple and continue what they were doing before. I think that there will be things like bathroom facilities, so on and so forth, in this new temple here. And like I said, there may be elevators. I don't know that when Jesus comes back, all modern technology and memory of modern technology is going to be wiped off the face of the earth. I don't know. I can't tell you for sure. I personally don't think that it will be. I think that things that we have today, technology that we have today, some of it may persist into the millennial kingdom. I think that it may. I can't tell you for sure. So if it does, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these were elevators in order to get up into higher levels. So Then we see in verse 18, and the pavement by that side of the gates over against the length of the gates was the lower pavement. Then he measured the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate unto the forefront of the inner court without, and 100 cubits eastward and northward. And so that's what you see here, these 100 cubits from gate to gate. And in verse 19 it says, then he measured the breadth from the we read verse 19. Verse 20, and the gate of the outward court that looked toward the north, and he measured the length thereof and the breadth thereof, and the little chambers thereof were 3 on this side and 3 on that side, and the posts thereof and the arches thereof were after the measure of the first gate, and the length thereof was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And their windows and their arches, and that's another thing. We see windows, arches, palm trees described here. You don't get to see that in this diagram, and you don't really have a lot of detail here either that shows where all the windows are and all the arches are. I mean, you can see some arches and windows, but it's not a lot of detail. So you have, just to get it into your mind, you have this massive structure here, and this is the structure that will be used in the millennial kingdom. I personally believe that actually Jesus' throne is in the temple. It's not somewhere else, that he actually reigns from the temple. And so Jesus exists inside this structure. Probably, if I had to guess, either all the way back here in the back toward the Holy of Holies or somewhere up in the top of this tower. Is where he spends most of his time, in one place or the other. I don't know exactly which, and it's possible that he may spend time in both. I do know that in the back structure, people aren't going to be going in there very much, because that will be the Holy of Holies. That's not something that's just going to be very flippantly walked in, even though it's going to have a bit of a different role in the millennium than it did in the Old Testament temple and tabernacle. It's still a holy place, a separate place, a sanctified place. It's different from the other places, and it's special. So, moving forward, this is verse 23. And the gate of the inner court was over against the gate toward the north, and toward the east, and he measured from gate to gate 100 cubits. And so again, we see this space here, this space here, this space here. That's 100 cubit space. And so if you were to go and use the 26-inch cubit, multiply that by about 100, you get about 2,600 inches. That's a space of over 200 feet. So you're looking at a big area, and it's nothing that's considered. I mean, just think, if this is over 200 feet, and then you have this, I mean, you're looking at almost a half-mile structure here, just from one end to the other, if you were to take it like that. So it's going to be a grand undertaking, not only to build and construct this, but then also to use it every day. It's going to be just this massive thing. You walk in and it's just there. It's ever present all the time. Verse 24, after that he brought me toward the south, and behold, a gate toward the south, and he measured the posts thereof and the arches thereof according to these measures, and there were windows in it, and the arches thereof round about, like those windows, and the length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And so the south, the east, and the north, it's all equidistant. It's all the same measurements. It's all, it's square here. This is rectangular. This structure is, and we can see that here. This is a rectangular structure. The gates are a rectangular structure, but overall, it's square. The same breadth, the same height, the same length. It's square all around the outside. And so Verse 26 says, "And there were 7 steps to go up to it, and the arches thereof were before them, and it had palm trees, one on this side, another on that side, upon the post thereof." And that's what these steps are here. You see there's steps here. You see there's steps here. I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see steps and steps. There's the northern steps, and then there's the inner northern steps. And so you're progressively moving upward as well. As you go into the temple, you're moving up. And then you go into the outer courtyard. And then you go into the temple's complex itself. You're still moving up. And then you go into the actual temple right here. You're still moving up. So you're progressively going up toward Christ as you make your way through this structure here. Or as a person who has the right and authority to move within each of these areas is making their way toward Christ as they are going up each flight of stairs. So we see in verse 27, it says, "And there was a gate in the inner court toward the south, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. Here again, it's the same measurement as we saw between the north and the north, the east and the east, the south and the south. Verse 28, "And he brought me to the inner court by the south gate, and he measured the south gate according to these measures. And the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, according to these measures, and there were windows in it, and in the arches thereof round about. It was 50 cubits long, and 25 cubits broad." That's the same measurements we had before. So what we're seeing is there's a lot of repetition here, and that's because it's all uniform. It's constructed exactly how God wants it in a uniform manner, and it's a representation of, I believe, of His glory in that way. Verse 30 says, "And the arches round about were 25 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad, and the arches thereof were toward the utter court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof, and going up to it had 8 steps." And so you see one of these stairways has 8 steps, and one of them has 7 steps. And so the height difference between this area and this area, and then the outer area and this area, is just a little bit different. I don't think there's any real significance as to say, well, 7 steps means this and 8 steps means this. I'm not going into it that deep to try to draw out some kind of significance that I don't think is there. But one is 8 and one is 7. That's the message there. That's just how it's built. Verse 33, or verse 32, "And he brought me into the inner court toward the east, and he measured the gate according to these measures." So now he's being brought into the inner court. He's going into here. "And the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof were according to these measures, and there were windows therein, and the arches thereof round about. It was 50 cubits long, and 25 cubits broad." The same measurements that we saw before. "And the arches thereof were toward the outward court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof, on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. Again, here 8 steps. "And he brought me to the north gate, and measured it according to these measures, the little chambers thereof, the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, and the windows to it round about. The length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 25 cubits." And so now he's talking about the north gate right here. Verse 37, "And the posts thereof were toward the utter court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof, on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And the chambers and the entries thereof were by the posts of the gates, where they washed the burnt offering." And so he's taken a tour, basically. This man who has the flax and the measuring reed has taken him all around this structure. He's got this. He's went from gate to gate. He's been here. He's been here. He's been here. He's been here, here, and here. He's seen these structures. He's now inside this inner court. And all Ezekiel is doing here, he's just describing what he's seeing. He's going through this building, and he's just, to the best of his ability, with the measuring reed that this man has, that he's with, describing, he's taking notes and relaying what he is seeing to us. And so we get a mention here at the end of verse 38. It says, the post of the gates where they wash the burnt offering. And so moving on into verse 39, it says, and in the porch of the gate were 2 tables on this side and 2 tables on that side, to slay thereon the burnt offering and the sin offering and the trespass offering. And so this is the millennial temple, millennial kingdom. But we read in Ezekiel chapter 40 that there are sacrifices. There are places here that are constructed specifically for the purpose of facilitating these sacrifices. And so it says in verse 41, 4 tables were on this side and 4 tables on that side by the side of the gate, 8 tables, whereupon they slew their sacrifices. And the 4 tables were of hewn stone for the burnt offering, of 1.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits broad, and 1 cubit high, whereupon also they laid the instruments wherewith they slew the burnt offerings and the sacrifice. And within were hooks, and hand broad, fastened round about, and upon the tables was the flesh of the offering. And so he's seeing the butcher shop. He sees it in operation. This is where they do this. This is where they do that. This is where they hang this. This is where they store that. And it's operating. It's going. It has a function. So very, very quickly, I want to discuss this, and we've discussed it a little bit before. But I'm going to look at Micah chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and you can either try to turn there with me, but I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Micah chapter 4, verses 1 and 2 says, but in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and he will walk in his paths, for the law shall go forth out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So you see the return of the law. Now, you ask, well, if Jesus is here and he's done his sacrifice on the cross, what purpose does the law have? Okay, let's look at what the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews chapter 9, and we can see what the Hebrews writer says the purpose of the law was in the Old Testament. Okay, Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 7, it says, but into the second went the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. The Holy Ghost this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices, that could not make him that did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience. Okay? It was a figure in the past, in the Old Testament. It was a figure. It could not make them perfect. And so it was a figure for the work of Christ that was to be done. It was pictorial. It was illustrative. It was allegorical. It was metaphorical. Whatever word you want to put on it. It was a symbol. Okay? If God used a symbol of something in the past, this thing had no efficacy for the saving of souls. It was not a substitute for Christ. It was not a replacement. It was not a placeholder. It was a picture, always a picture, pointing to Him. It was never the thing that did save you. It was always the thing that pointed to what saves you. If that's the case in the Old Testament, the same can be true in the millennial kingdom. It is the pictorial representation of what Christ has already done at this point for humanity. It has no saving power, the same that it had no saving power at the Old Testament. But it points to the work of Christ. As far as the individual is concerned. Now, I've also made the argument that God not only deals with individuals, he also deals with nations. Not only will individuals be making sacrifices, but specifically nations will be making sacrifices, which is a completely different ballgame. Because Jesus didn't die and shed his blood for nations. He died and shed his blood for every one singular individual human being. A nation in collective, a collective is not saved by the blood of Christ. If that were true, we'd be bringing a lot of people to heaven with us. Or we'd be trying anyway. But we can't do that. Okay? But you see in the Old Testament, and I believe what we'll see in the millennial kingdom, is that the nation makes these sacrifices for the sake of the nation, the collective, and it applies collectively. But the sacrifice of the individual is merely a pictorial representation of what they have already believed Christ to have done for them. So that's my understanding of the purpose and the nature of sacrifices in the millennial kingdom. I could be wrong. I could be misunderstanding. I could be adding details that may not actually be relevant. I might be missing details that are relevant. So don't take me as the sole authority on this. I don't think anybody has is in any danger of trusting me that deeply. But just in case, I'll throw that out there. So that, you see, is my argument for how that all makes sense in context with the rest of Scripture. Because I know some people may get confused if they see sacrifices happening in the future, and I was at first as well, because that's what prompted me to study it. Because the very first time I encountered this, I said, "Well, what's this all about? I thought this was over and done with. I thought this was fulfilled. Why are we going back?" There's no reversal. There's no backward movement. God isn't moving back. He's not undoing anything Christ did. He's just, again, this system exists in order to glorify him. So that's what it's all about here in the millennial kingdom. Moving forward, hopefully quickly through the rest of the chapter, it says in verse 44, "And without the inner gate were the chambers of the singers in the inner court, which was at the side of the north gate, and their prospect was toward the south, one at the side of the east gate, having the prospect toward the north. And he said unto me, This chamber whose prospect is toward the south is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the house, and the chamber whose prospect is toward the north is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok among the sons of Levi, which come near to the Lord to minister unto him." And so you see these chambers here, they have a purpose. And these chambers over here also have a purpose. In these porches here, these porches have a purpose for existing. And so these chambers here as well. You see there are additional chambers on the eastern side. There will be priests that inhabit these places. There will be singers that they stand there and their job is to sing. And they also inhabit this place. And so there will actually be rooms here where people, my understanding is that that's where they live. They live there. They stay in this temple and perform their duties. I think some of these may actually be dormitories or living facilities. And if we'll get into it later, but based on some of the things that I studied and read, some of these, you look at these chambers and you use the 26-inch cubit as the measurement, it makes these chambers come out to be the size of what basically the standard college dorm room. So if it's smaller than that's a pretty small living space. College dorm room isn't the most luxurious and largest, grandest place for somebody to live anyway. So if you use the 26-inch cubit, it makes these rooms, these chambers, habitable. at least comfortably habitable. And I don't think for a second that the millennial temple is, the priests in the millennial temple are going to have uncomfortable habitations in Christ's kingdom. I don't think that for a second. So, again, we'll try to move forward. It says in verse 47, "So he measured the court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, 4 square, and the altar that was before the house. And he brought me to the porch of the house. He measured each post of the porch 5 cubits on this side and 5 cubits on that side. And the breadth of the gate was 3 cubits on this side and 3 cubits on that side." And so here he's talking about the porch of the house. He's talking about this spot right here. And you can see, if you're able to see that text there, you see a lot of 41s. And so next chapter, we're going to be dealing a lot with this area right back here. This chapter, we've been dealing with all of this outer area. But Lord willing, next week we'll be dealing with what's in here. So he says the length of the porch was 20 cubits and the breadth 11 cubits, and he brought me by the steps whereby they went up to it, and there were pillars by the posts, one on this side and another on that side. So as poor as I was able to communicate that is the structure of the outer area of the temple that's described here in chapter 40. You see descriptions of the walls, you see descriptions of the outer courtyard, you see descriptions of the gates and of the inner courtyard, and of these porches here that you have on either side of each gate. And you get a little bit of insight into the purposes of some of the little details for this structure, with the living places and the workplaces for the priests and the singers. We don't know everything. Like I said, there's plenty of extra rooms here that we don't get any details about. We know nothing about them other than that they exist. And so to me, they are going to exist for a purpose. I don't think you're just going to have an empty room somewhere that's just, it's there so that way we can hire a maid to go clean it every once in a while. I don't think that's the purpose for it. I think it will be used. So that's Ezekiel chapter 40. Are there any very quick comments or questions?